Sarah adjusted her headset as she reviewed the assignment brief for what had to be the strangest documentary project of her career. The network had given her crew very specific instructions. Document the lives of supernatural creatures, struggling with modern suburban life. Maintain complete authenticity, and under no circumstances reveal that this was being filmed for human audiences. So, let me get this straight. Jake, her cameraman, said as they drove through Grimhaven, New Jersey, "We're supposed to pretend we're filming for the Supernatural Broadcasting Network and just hope they don't figure out we're human?" The research team says most of these creatures are so isolated from supernatural media that they won't question our credentials as long as we act professional, Sarah replied, checking her fake business cards one more time. They read, SBN Documentary Division, bringing your stories to the supernatural community. Mike, the sound engineer, looked up from his equipment. What happens if they figure it out? Sarah had asked the same question during the briefing. The network's answer had been disturbingly vague. Cross that bridge when you come to it. Just remember, Sarah said as they pulled up to a perfectly normal-looking suburban house. We're here to document how supernatural creatures are adapting to human society for other supernatural creatures who might be going through the same thing. We're on their side. The house belonged to Marcus Blackfur, and from the outside, it looked like every other house in the neighborhood. The only unusual detail was the reinforced mailbox and what appeared to be claw marks on the front door. Marcus answered the door wearing a World's #1 Dad t-shirt and holding a coffee mug that said Moon Day Motivation. He looked exactly like any other suburban dad, except for the slightly too sharp teeth and fingernails that were definitely claws. You must be the documentary crew from SBN, Marcus said, ushering them inside. I have to tell you, I never thought the Supernatural Broadcasting Network would be interested in a story like mine. Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Jake. Actually, stories like yours are exactly what our viewers want to see. Ordinary supernatural folks dealing with extraordinary challenges. Well, I appreciate that, Marcus said, leading them to the living room. Most supernatural media focuses on the glamorous stuff. Ancient vampire lords, powerful witches, dragons hoarding treasure in mountains. Nobody talks about what it's like to be a werewolf trying to coach your kid's little league team. They set up their equipment while Marcus continued talking, clearly relieved to have someone who understood his situation. The worst part is the isolation, Marcus said as Jake adjusted the lighting. I mean, I know there are other werewolves out there, but try finding them through normal channels. It's not like there's a Craigslist for lycanthropes. Sarah settled behind her camera, feeling increasingly guilty about the deception, but fascinated by what she was hearing. Whenever you're ready, Marcus, she said. Just tell us your story, like you're talking to other supernatural creatures who might be going through similar experiences. Marcus looked directly into the camera, and Sarah could see the relief in his eyes at finally having an audience who would understand. My name is Marcus Blackfur, and I've been a werewolf for 14 years now. And I gotta tell you, this whole creature of the night thing, it's gotten really fucking old. A crash came from upstairs, followed by a child's voice yelling, Sorry, Dad. Marcus sighed. That's my kid. Half werewolf, half the reason I started drinking before noon. The transformation genes skipped a generation with my ex-wife's family, but they came back full force with little Tommy. You other werewolf parents out there know what I'm talking about. Try explaining to a school principal why your 8-year-old occasionally howls during math class. Sarah realized she was getting a completely different perspective than she'd expected. Marcus wasn't performing for human audiences or trying to seem relatable to people who didn't understand supernatural life. He was speaking directly to what he assumed were other creatures dealing with similar challenges. The thing nobody tells you about modern werewolf parenting, Marcus continued, is that the traditional pack structure doesn't work when you're trying to maintain a suburban lifestyle. I can't exactly establish dominance over other parents at the PTA meeting by growling at them, you know? Jake was capturing everything with professional focus. But Sarah could see he was as fascinated as she was by this completely unguarded perspective. How do you manage the transformations? Sarah asked. Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Marcus scratched behind his ear in a gesture that looked distinctly canine. I've got a whole system worked out. I've got a reinforced shed in the backyard, noise-dampening insulation, and a very understanding neighbor who thinks I'm just really into woodworking. He pulled out his phone and showed them photos of what looked like a high-tech panic room disguised as a garden shed. The real problem is the unexpected transformations, Marcus said. Full moon? I can plan for that. But stress transformations? Those are what got me into therapy. Therapy? Oh yeah, there's a whole support group for supernatural creatures trying to make it in human society. We meet at the community center on Mondays. Best thing that ever happened to me, honestly. You should film them. Velma runs an amazing program. Sarah felt her documentary instincts tingling. Would they be open to being filmed? Are you kidding? Half of them are dying to tell their stories to someone who won't think they're crazy. There's this vampire Derek, who's got 400 years of experience, but can't figure out how to order groceries online. And Janet, she's a zombie nurse, which sounds like a contradiction but actually makes perfect sense when you think about it. Marcus was clearly warming up to his audience, speaking with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting years to have this conversation. The thing is, he continued, we're all trying to adapt to a world that wasn't built for us. Like, take my job situation. I work customer service for a cable company, right? But do you know how hard it is to stay calm when some human is screaming at you about their internet connection, when you could literally tear their throat out? Sarah made a note to follow up on the support group. This was exactly the kind of authentic content the network wanted, but she was also becoming genuinely invested in these creatures' stories. What would success look like for you? She asked. Marcus considered this seriously. Success would be not having to choose between being who I am and being able to function in society. Like, what if I could use my werewolf abilities in my job instead of hiding them? I've got enhanced senses, supernatural speed, incredible strength, but I'm stuck in a cubicle pretending to be human because that's the only way the world makes sense right now. Have you ever considered starting your own business? With what capital? And doing what? There's no business model for supernatural creature provides services using abilities that humans think are impossible. Marcus laughed, but there was frustration in it. Though I've got to say, I could run the hell out of a delivery service. I could get packages across town in minutes, work all night, never get tired. But try explaining that on a business loan application. After they finished filming Marcus, Sarah and her crew sat in their rental car, processing what they'd just documented. That was, Jake started. Completely different from what I expected, Sarah finished. He wasn't trying to seem normal or relatable to humans. He was just being honest about his experience. Did you notice he never questioned our credentials? Mike asked. He just assumed we were from the supernatural community. Sarah looked at her notes. The question is, do we keep pretending or do we tell them the truth? What did the network say about that? They said to use our judgment. Sarah started the car. Right now, my judgment says we keep filming. These stories need to be told, and if revealing we're human stops them from being honest, then we stay undercover, Jake agreed, at least until we understand what we're really documenting here. They drove to the Grim Haven Community Center, where Sarah's fake credentials got them permission to film the Monday night support group. As they set up their equipment, Velma Thornspell approached them with the professional enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting for this opportunity. I'm so glad the SBN is finally doing a piece on suburban supernatural integration, Velma said, helping them arrange chairs for optimal camera angles. There's such a stigma in the supernatural community about going suburban, like we're somehow less authentic if we're not living in castles or caves or whatever. What kind of stigma? Sarah asked, realizing she was learning about supernatural culture from the inside. Oh, you know how it is. The old guard thinks that adapting to human society means we're losing our supernatural identity. But what they don't understand is that we're not trying to become human. We're trying to create space for ourselves in a world that's already mixed. Velma gestured around the community center, which Sarah now noticed had been subtly modified for supernatural use. Stronger chairs, temperature controls that went to extremes, and lighting that could be dimmed to almost nothing. The creatures who come to my group aren't failures, Velma continued. They're pioneers. They're figuring out how to be authentically supernatural in a modern context. As the group members began arriving, Sarah realized she was about to document something unprecedented. Supernatural creatures being completely honest about their experiences because they believed they were talking to their own community. Derek Bloodsworth arrived first, wearing sunglasses indoors and moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate a world that wasn't built for his needs. Evening, Velma, he said, then noticed the camera crew. Oh, you're the SBN people? I have to say, it's about time someone documented what suburban, supernatural life is really like. What do you hope viewers will take away from this? Sarah asked. Derek settled into his chair, which Sarah noticed had been positioned to avoid any direct light sources. I hope they'll understand that integration doesn't mean assimilation, Derek said. I'm not trying to become human. I'm trying to be a vampire in a human-dominated world. There's a difference. Janet Rottingham arrived next. Her nurse's scrubs impeccably clean, but her movements slightly off in ways that suggested her body didn't quite work like a living person's should. "Oh, good, the documentary crew is here," Janet said, adjusting her name tag. "I've been hoping someone would cover the healthcare worker angle. Do you know how many supernatural creatures are working in essential services? We're everywhere, but nobody talks about it." "Why do you think that is?" Sarah asked. "Because admitting we exist would force humans to confront how much they actually depend on us," Janet said matter-of-factly. "I work night shifts at the hospital, and I'm the only nurse who can cover 24 hours without getting tired. But officially, I'm just very dedicated." Azeroth arrived with the harried energy of someone getting off a retail shift, still wearing his Starbucks apron. "Sorry I'm late," he said to the group. "Manager made me stay to clean the espresso machine." Again. He noticed the cameras and brightened. "Oh hey, you're documenting this for SBN? That's fantastic. I've been saying for years that supernatural creatures in customer service have stories that need to be told." Betty Scales was the last to arrive, and Sarah immediately noticed that the temperature in the room rose several degrees when she entered. "I hope I'm not too late," Betty said, settling carefully into a reinforced chair. "I got held up by another visit from the fire marshal. Apparently, my garden shed, spontaneously combusting, is still considered a municipal issue." She noticed the camera crew and smiled. "Oh, wonderful. SBN is here." "I was hoping Supernatural Media would start covering the challenges of supernatural retirement. The AARP doesn't exactly have resources for dragons, you know." As the group settled in, Sarah realized she was about to witness something extraordinary, a completely unfiltered conversation between supernatural creatures who believed they were finally talking to an audience that would understand them. "All right, everyone," Velma said. "Let's start with our weekly check-ins. Since we have SBN here documenting our stories, this might be a good opportunity to really dig into what suburban supernatural life is like for our viewers who might be considering similar moves." "I'll start," Marcus said. "And I want to be really honest about this, because I know there are other werewolf parents out there watching who are probably dealing with the same stuff." He looked directly into Sarah's camera, and she realized he was speaking to what he imagined was an audience of supernatural creatures across the country. "This week, I had 3 transformations, 1 planned, 2 stress-induced. The planned one went fine. I've got my shed set up, noise dampening, the works. But the stress ones? Those are still kicking my ass." The group murmured sympathetically, and Sarah understood she was hearing the kind of support that only came from shared experience. Tuesdays was a false alarm. Turned out the neighbor's dog was just being friendly, but it triggered my territorial response. But Wednesday? Marcus shook his head. "Wednesday, I ate another delivery guy." "We acknowledge your struggle, Marcus," the group said in unison, clearly established ritual. "The worst part? He was delivering my anger management workbooks. The ones I ordered specifically to deal with the stress transformations. The irony was not lost on me." Sarah looked at her crew. Jake was filming with the focus of someone who understood they were documenting something unique. Mike was monitoring audio levels that probably shouldn't exist outside of special effects studios. And she was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about supernatural creatures adapting to human society. It was about the gap between how supernatural and human communities saw each other. "Derek, how was your week?" Velma asked. Derek adjusted his sunglasses and spoke with the weariness of someone who'd been fighting the same battles for centuries. "I spent 6 hours yesterday watching my neighbor wash his car through a crack in my blackout curtains. 6 hours. And you know what I was thinking the whole time? This is what 400 years of existence has come to. Voyeuristic car washing surveillance." He turned to address the camera directly. "To any other vampires watching this, the loneliness is real. Yes, we can theoretically live forever, but eternity is a lot less appealing when you spend it hiding from the world. Have you considered online community groups?" Velma suggested. "Velma, I can't figure out grocery delivery because it only works during daylight hours. Online community groups assume a level of technological adaptation that I haven't achieved yet." Though, he paused. "If any tech-savvy vampires are watching this and want to start a consulting business for digitally challenged immortals, call me." Sarah made a mental note about the business opportunity Derek had just identified, then realized she was thinking like a documentary filmmaker, documenting real people with real problems, not actors playing roles. Janet, your update? Well, Janet said, reattaching her left arm after it had apparently come loose during the conversation. I had what I'm calling a breakthrough at work this week. She turned to face the camera. To any other undead healthcare workers out there, we need to stop apologizing for our condition and start leveraging it. How so? Sarah asked, genuinely curious. I don't get tired. I don't get sick. I can work shifts that would kill living people, literally. Instead of hiding this, I started documenting it. I presented my supervisor with data showing that I've worked 847 consecutive days without calling in sick, covered more overtime hours than any other nurse in the hospital's history, and maintained patient satisfaction scores that are literally impossible for living healthcare workers. The group was listening intently, and Sarah realized she was watching supernatural creatures learn from each other in real time. What happened? Betty asked. They gave me a raise and asked if I knew any other dedicated nurses who might be looking for work. Janet grinned, and Sarah noticed her teeth were in remarkably good condition for someone who was technically dead. I may have started recruiting from online zombie communities. That's brilliant, Azeroth said. I've been thinking about the same thing with customer service, like I'm literally a demon. My supernatural patience with difficult customers should be seen as an asset, not something to hide, Janet said. Exactly. We're not broken humans. We're supernatural creatures with abilities that happen to be incredibly useful in modern society. Betty raised her hand. I hate to interrupt, but I think I'm having my own breakthrough moment here. She turned to address the camera directly, and Sarah could see flames literally dancing behind her eyes. I've been trying to garden like a human, Betty said, following human gardening books, using human techniques, growing human plants. But I'm not human. I'm a dragon. What if I stopped trying to grow human gardens and started growing dragon gardens? What would that look like? Velma asked, clearly as intrigued as the camera crew. Plants that thrive on fire instead of being destroyed by it? Gardens that are literally impossible for humans to create but perfectly natural for dragons. Betty was getting excited, and small wisps of smoke were escaping her nostrils. Instead of fighting my nature, I could use it to create something beautiful that no one else can make. Sarah realized she was watching something extraordinary, a group of supernatural creatures who were shifting from trying to fit into human society to imagining how they could transform it. This is what I've been trying to tell you all, Derek said, leaning forward with an energy Sarah hadn't seen from him before. We're approaching this wrong. We're trying to adapt to a human world when what we should be doing is creating a world that works for everyone. What do you mean? Marcus asked. Derek stood up, and for the first time since Sarah had been filming him, he looked like someone who had lived for 4 centuries. Marcus, you're a werewolf with superhuman speed and senses trying to work in customer service. But what if you started a delivery company that specifically utilized supernatural speed? Janet, you're an undead nurse pretending to be unusually dedicated? What if you started a 24-hour medical service that marketed supernatural reliability? Betty, you're a dragon trying to grow human plants. What if you became the world's first fire-based agricultural specialist? The room had gone completely silent, except for the sound of Sarah's equipment, recording what felt like a pivotal moment. And me? Derek continued. I'm a vampire with 400 years of experience who can work all night and never needs vacation time. Instead of trying to fit into human business hours, what if I started a consulting firm that specifically operates during hours when humans can't work? Sarah looked at her crew and realized they were documenting what might be the beginning of a completely new approach to supernatural human integration. What about the humans? Azeroth asked quietly. I mean, what happens when they figure out what we're really doing? Derek smiled, and for the first time, he didn't hide his fangs. Azeroth, you make the best coffee in the tri-state area because you can heat milk with supernatural precision. Do you think humans are going to complain about that when they taste the results? 3 weeks after filming the support group, Sarah and her crew returned to Grimhaven to find that Derek's speech had triggered what could only be described as a supernatural business revolution. I can't believe how fast this happened, Sarah said to Jake as they drove through downtown Grimhaven. Where 3 weeks ago there had been empty storefronts and struggling businesses, there was now construction everywhere and signs announcing the Grimhaven Supernatural Business Cooperative. They were meeting the group at what used to be an empty lot behind the community center, but was now a construction site buzzing with activity that seemed to defy several laws of physics. Marcus, Sarah called as she spotted the werewolf directing what appeared to be the installation of delivery equipment that looked nothing like any delivery service she'd ever seen. "Hey, SBN crew!" Marcus waved them over, grinning with an enthusiasm that was completely different from the frustrated suburban dad they'd first interviewed. "You guys are gonna love this. We actually did it. We stopped trying to fit in and started building something that fits us." Sarah set up her camera as Marcus explained the transformation that had happened since their last visit. "So, after Derek's speech about not adapting to the human world, we all went home and just started," Marcus said. "I mean, what's the worst that could happen, right? I was already eating delivery drivers. How much worse could it get?" He gestured to the construction around them. "Derek used some of his considerable savings to buy this lot. Turns out, when you've been alive for 4 centuries and you're good with money, you accumulate resources." "Where is Derek?" Sarah asked. "Basement." Marcus pointed to a building that looked normal above ground but had clearly been extensively excavated below. "He's setting up his consulting office, completely underground, climate-controlled, accessible 24 hours a day. No windows." As if summoned, Derek appeared from a basement entrance, wearing a business suit instead of his usual casual clothes and looking more energetic than Sarah had ever seen him. "SBN crew, perfect timing," Derek said, approaching with a stack of business cards. "Welcome to the grand experiment. We're creating the first openly supernatural business cooperative in North America." "Openly supernatural?" Sarah asked. "Well," Derek grinned, "openly supernatural to humans who can handle it. Carefully marketed supernatural abilities to humans who can't. The key is leading with results." He handed Sarah a business card that read Midnight Solutions, 24-hour business consulting, when your problems can't wait for morning. "I've already got 3 clients," Derek said with obvious pride. "Turns out, there are a lot of business owners who need help during off hours, and when you can provide genuinely supernatural insight into their problems." "Okay, what kind of problems?" Jake asked, still filming. "Last night, I helped a restaurant owner redesign their kitchen workflow using principles I learned from managing castle logistics in the 14th century. Night before that, I consulted on a retail inventory system using organizational methods I developed when I was, well, let's just say I have experience managing large collections of valuable items." Sarah realized Derek was talking about his vampire past without actually saying the word vampire on camera. Probably in case any humans saw the footage. "The point is," Derek continued, "I stopped trying to hide 4 centuries of experience and started marketing it as an asset." Turns out, businesses love hiring consultants with extensive historical perspective on management challenges. A crash from across the construction site interrupted them, followed by what sounded like someone swearing in a language Sarah couldn't identify. "That would be Betty," Marcus said fondly. "She's having some challenges with the agricultural setup." They walked over to where Betty was standing, in what appeared to be a carefully controlled fire, talking to a group of very confused-looking landscapers. "No, no, no," Betty was saying patiently, as flames danced around her without burning her clothes. "The fire-resistant plants go in the high-heat section. The ones that require direct flame cultivation go over here." One of the landscapers, a middle-aged man who looked like he'd been working in traditional gardening his entire life, raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been doing landscaping for 20 years, and I've never heard of plants that require fire to grow." Betty smiled kindly. "That's because you've never worked with a dragon before, Harold. These are specialty agricultural techniques that aren't taught in standard horticulture programs." She gestured to a section of the lot where plants were growing that Sarah was fairly certain shouldn't exist. They seemed to shimmer with their own internal light, and some appeared to be producing small, controlled flames from their leaves. "The beautiful thing about dragon fire cultivation," Betty continued, "is that it allows for plant varieties that are completely impossible with traditional methods. Higher nutritional content, unique flavors, and they're naturally pest-resistant because most insects can't survive the heat requirements." Harold, the landscaper, was taking notes like his life depended on it. "So when you say fire cultivation," Harold asked slowly, "you mean—" "I mean I breathe controlled fire directly onto the plants to stimulate growth," Betty said matter-of-factly. "It's a very specialized technique. I'm probably the only person in New Jersey who can do it properly." Sarah watched Harold process this information, and she could practically see him deciding that he didn't care how unusual it was if it produced results like what he was seeing. "Can you teach this?" Harold asked. "Well," Betty said thoughtfully, I could teach the principles, but the actual fire-breathing part is somewhat species-specific. However, I could probably design cultivation systems that would work for human gardeners using alternative heat sources. Sarah realized she was watching supernatural creatures, not hiding their abilities, but not exactly revealing them either. They were presenting their supernatural talents as specialized skills that produced unprecedented results. "Where are Janet and Azeroth?" she asked Marcus. "Janet's at the hospital finishing her shift, but she'll be here later to set up the urgent care clinic. And Azeroth?" Marcus grinned. "Azeroth is about to revolutionize the coffee industry." They walked to where Azeroth had set up what looked like a coffee station, designed by someone who understood fire in ways that human engineers never could. The equipment was standard espresso machinery, but Sarah could see modifications that definitely weren't standard. The thing about supernatural coffee preparation, Azeroth was explaining to a small crowd of what appeared to be coffee enthusiasts and potential investors, is precision. When you can control temperature at the molecular level, you can extract flavors from coffee beans that no conventional method can achieve. He demonstrated by making what looked like a standard latte, but Sarah could see tiny flames dancing between his fingers as he steamed the milk. The result was foam art that seemed to move and shift in the cup. "How do you do that?" asked a woman who was clearly trying to figure out if this was some kind of performance art or actual supernatural ability. "Trade secrets," Azeroth said with a grin that showed just a hint of his demonic nature. "But I can tell you that it involves very precise heat control and techniques that I've been developing for, well, let's just say I've had a lot of time to perfect them." The woman sipped the latte, and her eyes widened. "This is incredible. I've never tasted anything like it." "Exactly," Azeroth said. "That's because no one else can make it. This isn't just coffee. It's impossible coffee. Coffee that can only be created using techniques that no one else has access to." Sarah realized what was happening. The supernatural creatures weren't revealing their true nature to humans, but they also weren't hiding their abilities. They were presenting themselves as incredibly skilled specialists with unique techniques that produced impossible results. "It's brilliant," she murmured to Jake. "What's brilliant?" "They're not lying about what they are, but they're not exactly telling the whole truth either. They're letting humans draw their own conclusions about how they achieve these results." Janet arrived just as Sarah was processing this, looking more energetic and confident than Sarah had ever seen her. "Sorry I'm late," Janet said to the group. "Had to finish setting up the partnership agreement with Grimhaven General." "Partnership agreement?" Derek asked. Janet grinned. "They want me to expand into a 24-hour urgent care service. Turns out, when you can demonstrate that you've worked 850 consecutive days without missing a shift, maintain perfect patient satisfaction scores, and can handle medical emergencies that require unusual flexibility, hospitals start asking you to write your own contract." She gestured to a section of the building that was being converted into a medical facility. "I'm going to be running the only 24-hour urgent care clinic in the tri-state area that's actually staffed 24 hours a day by the same practitioner. No shift changes, no communication errors, no coverage gaps." "And the humans don't find that suspicious?" Sarah asked. "They find it incredibly impressive," Janet corrected. "I told them I have a rare medical condition that allows me to function on very little sleep and gives me unusual flexibility in emergency situations," which is technically true. Sarah was beginning to understand the strategy. The supernatural creatures were being completely honest about their abilities, while allowing humans to interpret those abilities in ways that made sense within human understanding. "The question is," Derek said, "how do we make this sustainable? We can't just rely on humans not asking too many questions." "Actually," Velma said, appearing with an armload of paperwork, "I think the humans are asking exactly the right questions." She spread the papers on a makeshift table. "I've been contacted by reporters from 3 different business magazines, 2 television shows about innovative entrepreneurs, and the Small Business Administration wants to feature us as a case study in creative specialization." "Meaning?" Marcus asked. "Meaning," Velma said, "that human society is so hungry for genuinely exceptional service that they don't care if the methods are unconventional. They just want results." Sarah looked around the construction site, where supernatural creatures and human workers were collaborating on building something that had never existed before. The humans were clearly curious about the unusual methods their supernatural colleagues were using. but they were also obviously impressed by the results. It's working because you're not trying to be human, Sarah realized. You're being supernaturally good at serving human needs. Exactly, Derek said. Instead of hiding what makes us different, we're using it to provide services that no human business could match. As the day continued, Sarah documented something she'd never seen before: supernatural creatures working openly alongside humans who were gradually realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary, but were too impressed by the results to care about the methods. The construction workers were amazed by Betty's precision fire control. The landscapers were fascinated by her cultivation techniques. The business investors were intrigued by Derek's unconventional consulting methods. The coffee enthusiasts were obsessed with Azeroth's impossible brewing techniques. And through it all, the supernatural creatures were more confident and energetic than Sarah had ever seen them, because for the first time in their lives, they were using their abilities instead of hiding them. "This is going to change everything," Sarah said to Jake as they packed up their equipment that evening. "You think it'll work long-term?" Sarah looked back at the construction site, where lights were still on and work was continuing into the night. Because when your workforce includes creatures who don't need to sleep, there's no reason to stop working when the sun goes down. "I think," Sarah said, "that we're documenting the beginning of a completely new kind of society. One where being different isn't something to hide, it's something to capitalize on." 2 months later, Sarah's crew was back in Grimhaven to film what was supposed to be a follow-up episode about the success of the Supernatural Business Cooperative. What they found instead was the supernatural community dealing with a crisis they'd never anticipated: too much human attention. "We have a problem," Derek said, greeting them at what was now the main entrance to the Supernatural Business District. The construction was complete, and the results were stunning. A collection of businesses that looked like something out of a fantasy novel, but functioned with ruthless efficiency. "What kind of problem?" Sarah asked, setting up her camera in Derek's underground office, which had been transformed into something that looked like a high-end consulting firm, decorated by someone with centuries of taste in luxury goods. "The good news is, we're more successful than we ever imagined," Derek said, settling behind a desk that probably cost more than Sarah's car. "Marcus's delivery service has a 3-week waiting list. Betty's Garden Center has orders from restaurants across the East Coast. Azeroth's coffee shop has lines around the block every morning. And my consulting firm is booked solid for the next 6 months." "That sounds like good news," Jake observed from behind his camera. "It is," Derek said. "The problem is that our success is attracting the kind of attention we weren't prepared for." He pulled out a stack of newspapers and magazines, all featuring headlines about the Grimhaven miracle and the impossible businesses that were revolutionizing their industries. Forbes wants to do a cover story. 60 Minutes called yesterday. The Food Network wants to film a special about Azeroth's coffee techniques. And the Discovery Channel wants to document Betty's revolutionary agricultural methods. Sarah understood the problem immediately. "They're going to want to know how you do what you do." "Exactly. And I'm a 400-year-old vampire with centuries of business experience isn't going to work as an explanation for mainstream media." "What about the strategy you've been using? Let humans draw their own conclusions." Derek laughed, but there was stress in it. "That works when you're dealing with individual customers or small business partners. But investigative journalists, they're going to dig." As if summoned by the conversation, Marcus appeared in the office doorway, looking harried. "Derek, we need to talk," Marcus said. "I just got off the phone with someone from the Department of Transportation. They want to study my delivery methods because I'm achieving speeds that they say are physically impossible for conventional vehicles." "What did you tell them?" "I told them I use unconventional routes and work primarily at night when there's less traffic," Marcus said, slumping into a chair. "Which is true. I just didn't mention that my unconventional routes involve running through forests and jumping over buildings." Sarah was beginning to understand the magnitude of the challenge. The supernatural creatures had been so successful at using their abilities to serve human customers that they'd created a situation where humans wanted to understand and replicate their methods. "Where are the others?" Sarah asked. "Betty's hiding in her greenhouse," Marcus said. "A team from the agricultural department showed up this morning wanting to document her unique cultivation techniques for possible use by other farmers. She's currently pretending to have the flu." "And Janet?" "Janet's at the hospital, but she's got reporters from Medical News Today. coming next week to interview her about how she maintains such incredible stamina and perfect patient care scores. Derek stood up and began pacing, which was impressive considering they were in a basement office. The irony is that we solved the problem of hiding from human society by being so good at serving human needs that now they want to turn us into a case study for other humans to emulate. What about Azeroth? Sarah asked. That's complicated, Marcus said. They made their way upstairs to Demon Brews, where they found Azeroth behind his coffee counter, looking more stressed than Sarah had ever seen him. The shop was packed with customers, but there were also several people with professional cameras and notepads who were clearly not there just for coffee. Azeroth, called a woman with a press badge, can you show us again how you create those moving flame patterns in the foam? Our viewers are dying to know your technique. Azeroth looked up and caught sight of Sarah's camera. His expression was a mixture of panic and relief. Panic at the human attention. Relief at seeing what he thought was supernatural media. Oh, thank the underworld, SBN is here, he said, loud enough for the human reporters to hear. Maybe you can help explain to these enthusiasts that some techniques require very specialized training. Parentheses, Sarah realized Azeroth was using their presence as supernatural media to deflect the human reporters' questions. Parentheses, what kind of specialized training? The reporter pressed. Well, Azeroth said carefully, glancing at Sarah's camera as if seeking support. It's a family technique passed down through generations. Very cultural specific methods that require particular physical attributes that are quite rare. Parentheses, could you teach it to others? I'm afraid not. It's not just a skill. It's a genetic predisposition. Like being born with perfect pitch, but for temperature control. Sarah watched the reporters scribbling notes, clearly trying to figure out how to turn this into a story about unique artisanal techniques rather than supernatural abilities. The problem, Derek explained quietly to Sarah while the reporter continued questioning Azeroth, is that our success is too obvious to ignore. But our methods are impossible to explain without revealing what we really are. Have you considered just telling them? Sarah asked. Derek stared at her. Telling humans that we're supernatural creatures? You've proven that you can provide valuable services. You've integrated into the community. You're contributing to the economy. Maybe humans are more ready for the truth than you think. Sarah, Marcus said quietly, you work for supernatural media. You understand our world, but mainstream human society? They're not ready for vampires and werewolves and demons to be their business partners. Sarah felt a stab of guilt about her deception. But before she could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the windows of Demon Brews, they could see a news van pulling up, followed by what appeared to be a government vehicle. That's not good, Derek said. Velma burst through the door looking more frazzled than Sarah had ever seen her. We have a situation, Velma announced. Councilman Henderson is outside with a team from the State Business Development Office, 2 news crews, and someone from the Federal Small Business Administration. What do they want? Betty asked, appearing from behind the counter where she'd apparently been hiding. They want to declare us a special economic development zone, Velma said. They want to study our methods so they can replicate them in other communities across the country. The supernatural creatures looked at each other with the expression of people who'd solved one problem only to create a much bigger one. They can't replicate our methods, Janet said, entering through the back door, still wearing her hospital scrubs. Our methods are us. You can't teach someone to be a zombie nurse or a vampire consultant or a dragon gardener. That's what we need to explain to them, Derek said. The question is how. Sarah looked around at the supernatural creatures she'd been documenting for months. They'd solved the problem of hiding their abilities by being so good at using them that humans couldn't ignore the results. But success had created a new challenge. How do you maintain supernatural identity in a world that wants to systematize and replicate everything? What if, Sarah said slowly, instead of trying to explain why your methods can't be replicated, you focused on why they don't need to be? What do you mean? Azeroth asked, still making coffee with movements that were definitely not entirely human, while trying to appear normal to the watching reporters. I mean, what if the Grimhaven model isn't about replicating specific techniques, but about creating space for people to use whatever unique abilities they have? Derek raised an eyebrow. Go on. Every community has people with unusual skills. different perspectives, unconventional approaches. The Grimhaven model isn't about being supernatural. It's about not hiding what makes you exceptional. Sarah realized she was talking not just as a documentary filmmaker, but as someone who'd come to genuinely care about the community she'd been documenting. You don't have to tell them you're vampires and werewolves, she continued. You just have to tell them that you stopped trying to be normal and started trying to be excellent. Marcus looked thoughtful. So we're not supernatural creatures adapting to human society. We're just people who figured out how to turn their differences into assets. Exactly. And that's a model that any community can follow, regardless of whether their residents are supernatural or just unusual. Betty smiled, and small flames danced behind her eyes. I like that. We're not hiding what we are, but we're also not making it about what we are. We're making it about what we do. The question is, Derek said, how do we handle the immediate situation? There are reporters and government officials outside who want answers right now. We tell them the truth, Janet said, just not the whole truth. Meaning? We tell them we're a community of people with unusual backgrounds and specialized skills who decided to stop trying to fit into conventional business models and started building businesses around our actual abilities. Azeroth grinned, which is completely accurate. And when they ask for specifics about our techniques, Marcus asked, we tell them that our techniques are the result of years of specialized training, unique family backgrounds, and personal attributes that can't be easily replicated, Betty said. Also completely accurate. Derek nodded slowly. And if they want to study us, we let them study our business model, Velma said. The framework of building businesses around individual strengths instead of trying to force everyone into standard templates. That's something that could be replicated anywhere. Sarah realized she was watching the supernatural community evolve their integration strategy in real time. Instead of choosing between hiding and revealing their true nature, they were finding a middle path that allowed them to be authentic without being specific. Are you ready to face the reporters? Sarah asked. Derek straightened his tie and checked his reflection in the window. I've been alive for 400 years. I think I can handle a press conference. Just remember, Marcus said, we're not supernatural creatures trying to be normal. We're exceptional people who figured out how to be profitable. They walked outside to face the crowd of reporters, government officials, and curious onlookers who had gathered around what was now being called the Grimhaven phenomenon. Councilman Henderson stepped forward with the enthusiasm of a politician who'd realized he was standing next to something that was going to make his career. Ladies and gentlemen, Henderson announced, I'd like you to meet the entrepreneurs behind Grimhaven's economic miracle. These remarkable individuals have demonstrated that innovation comes from embracing what makes us different, not from trying to fit into conventional molds. Sarah positioned herself and her crew to document what she realized was going to be a crucial moment, the first time the supernatural community would speak publicly about their success without being able to rely on the assumption that their audience understood supernatural culture. Derek stepped forward first, and Sarah could see him drawing on centuries of experience dealing with humans who didn't know his true nature. Thank you, Councilman Henderson, Derek said, his voice carrying the authority that came from having survived multiple historical eras. What we've built here in Grimhaven isn't just a business cooperative. It's a model for what happens when communities create space for their residents to contribute their best abilities instead of forcing everyone to conform to narrow definitions of normal. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Bloodsworth, can you explain how you achieve such remarkable results in your consulting work? I draw on extensive experience with organizational systems that most modern consultants haven't encountered, Derek said smoothly. My background includes exposure to management principles and logistics challenges that provide perspectives most business schools don't teach. Sarah watched the reporter scribble notes, clearly interpreting this as Derek having some kind of unusual educational or cultural background, rather than 4 centuries of supernatural experience. Scales, another reporter called to Betty, your agricultural techniques are producing results that agricultural scientists say shouldn't be possible. What's your secret? Betty smiled, and Sarah noticed she was carefully controlling her breathing to avoid any visible flames. I use cultivation methods that incorporate environmental factors most traditional farming ignores, Betty said. My techniques require very specific temperature and atmospheric control that I've spent decades learning to manage. It's not something that can be easily taught. It requires both natural aptitude and extensive specialized training. Could these methods be scaled up for commercial agriculture? My methods are specifically adapted to my particular abilities and the unique conditions I can create, Betty said. But the principle of matching cultivation techniques to individual capabilities, rather than forcing everyone to use identical methods, that could certainly be applied more broadly. Sarah realized Betty had just explained dragonfire agriculture without mentioning dragons. The questions continued, and Sarah watched the supernatural creatures navigate them with increasing confidence. They weren't lying, but they were allowing the reporters to interpret their answers through purely human frameworks. When Azeroth was asked about his coffee techniques, he explained them in terms of precise temperature control based on natural sensitivity to heat variations. When Janet was asked about her medical efficiency, she described it as metabolic advantages that allow for extended work periods without fatigue. When Marcus was asked about his delivery speed, he talked about optimized routing and natural athletic ability. Everything they said was technically true, but none of it revealed their supernatural nature. The real innovation here, Velma concluded when asked about the cooperative success, isn't any specific technique. It's the idea that businesses should be built around what people can actually do exceptionally well, rather than trying to make everyone fit the same mold. After the press conference ended and the reporters left to file their stories, the supernatural community gathered back in Derek's office to assess how it had gone. "I think," Derek said, loosening his tie, "we may have just solved our human problem." "How so?" Sarah asked. "We gave them a story they can understand and use," Marcus said. "The story of unconventional people building businesses around their unique abilities. They don't need to know we're supernatural to find that inspiring." "And if someone figures out what we really are?" Azeroth asked. "Then we deal with that when it happens," Betty said. "But for now, we've given human society a framework for understanding us that doesn't require them to accept the existence of vampires and werewolves." Janet nodded. "We're not hiding anymore, but we're also not forcing humans to confront realities they might not be ready for." Sarah realized she was documenting something unprecedented, a supernatural community that had found a way to be simultaneously authentic and accessible, revealing their true nature without forcing humans to acknowledge supernatural reality. "The question is," Derek said, looking directly at Sarah's camera, "whether other supernatural communities can learn from what we've built here. Whether the Grimhaven model can work for creatures in other cities who are tired of hiding what they are." Sarah felt another stab of guilt about her deception, but also excitement about the story she was documenting. Whether the network had intended it or not, she was filming something that could genuinely change how supernatural and human communities understood each other. "What's next for Grimhaven?" she asked. "Expansion," Velma said, pulling out a map covered with pins. "We've been contacted by supernatural individuals and communities from across the country who want to try the Grimhaven approach in their own cities. And you're going to help them?" "We're going to document what works and what doesn't," Derek said. "Create a replicable framework that other communities can adapt to their own situations." "A franchise model for supernatural integration?" Sarah asked. "A franchise model for turning differences into advantages," Marcus corrected. "Whether those differences are supernatural or just unusual." As Sarah and her crew packed up their equipment, she realized they documented something much bigger than a story about supernatural creatures adapting to suburban life. They'd filmed the emergence of a new social model that could work for anyone who'd ever felt like they didn't fit into conventional society. The question was, what would happen when the documentary aired and human audiences realized they'd been watching real supernatural creatures solving real integration challenges, not actors performing metaphorical roles? But that, Sarah thought, was a problem for future episodes. 6 months later, Sarah Chen sat in a conference room that felt like a courtroom, facing an executive review board that was trying to decide whether to fire her or give her the biggest promotion in the network's history. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," said Margaret Stone, the network president, reviewing the footage that Sarah's team had compiled. "You were sent to document small businesses in suburban New Jersey. Instead, you discovered an actual community of supernatural creatures and documented their integration into human society." "That's correct," Sarah said. "And at no point in the past 8 months did you think to inform the network that you were filming actual vampires, werewolves, and demons instead of the small business owners we thought we were paying you to document." Sarah looked around the conference room, where her footage was playing on multiple screens. On one monitor, Marcus was demonstrating his supernatural delivery speed. On another, Betty was breathing controlled fire onto plants that immediately flourished. A third showed Derek discussing business strategies he'd learned during the French Revolution. Initially, I thought it might be an elaborate performance art project, Sarah said. By the time I realized they were genuine supernatural creatures, I was so invested in their stories that I felt the documentary needed to be completed. Sarah, said Tom Bradley, the head of documentary programming, this footage is either the most important documentary evidence in human history or the most elaborate hoax ever perpetrated on a television network. I understand your concern, Sarah said, but I've spent months documenting these individuals. I verified their abilities, their backgrounds, and their impact on their community. What they've accomplished in Grimhaven is real, regardless of whether they're supernatural or just extraordinarily talented humans. Margaret Stone leaned forward. The footage you've provided shows what appear to be individuals with abilities that violate several laws of physics. Our legal department is concerned about liability issues if we broadcast material that could be interpreted as promoting belief in supernatural phenomena. On the other hand, Tom added, if this footage is genuine, we're looking at the most significant documentary series in television history. Sarah had been preparing for this conversation for weeks, ever since she'd finally decided to tell the network the truth about what she'd been filming. I'd like to propose a solution, she said, pulling out a presentation she'd prepared. Instead of debating whether the subjects are genuinely supernatural, let's focus on what they've achieved and how it could be replicated. She clicked to her first slide, which showed economic data from Grimhaven. Regardless of the methods used, the Grimhaven Business Cooperative has achieved documented results. 340% increase in local business revenue, 89% reduction in unemployment, 67% increase in property values, and 98% resident satisfaction ratings. The next slide showed media coverage from business publications that had covered the Grimhaven story without focusing on the supernatural aspects. Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and the Wall Street Journal have all featured the Grimhaven model as an example of innovative community economic development. The focus has been on building businesses around individual strengths, rather than forcing conformity to standard models. Margaret Stone studied the data. You're suggesting we frame this as a business innovation story rather than a supernatural documentary? I'm suggesting we let viewers draw their own conclusions, Sarah said. We present the footage exactly as we filmed it, but we position it as a study of unconventional approaches to community development and individual entrepreneurship. Tom looked intrigued. How would that work practically? Sarah clicked to her next slide, which showed a proposed marketing approach. Fed Up, the Grimhaven Experiment, a documentary series about individuals who stopped trying to fit conventional molds and started building businesses around their actual abilities. Whether viewers interpret the subjects as having supernatural abilities or just extraordinary skills becomes irrelevant to the core message, which is that communities thrive when they create space for people to contribute their best abilities, instead of forcing everyone to conform to narrow definitions of normal. The room fell silent as the executives considered this approach. What about the subjects themselves? Margaret asked. How do they feel about being broadcast to human audiences? Sarah felt the familiar stab of guilt about the deception she'd maintained for months. That, she said, is something we need to discuss with them. 2 days later, Sarah found herself back in Grimhaven, but this time with network executives in tow, and a very different conversation to have with the supernatural community she'd been documenting. They met in the conference room of the Supernatural Business Cooperative, which had become the de facto headquarters for what was now being studied as a model for community economic development. So, Derek said, settling into his chair, with the careful precision Sarah had learned to recognize as his way of preparing for difficult conversations. You want to explain why SBN suddenly needs network approval for a documentary that's already been filmed. Sarah looked around the room at the supernatural creatures who'd trusted her with their stories for 8 months and realized there was no way to ease into this revelation. Because SBN doesn't exist, she said. I work for a human television network, and I've been documenting your stories for human audiences. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the air conditioning system cycling on. I'm sorry, Marcus said slowly. Did you just say you're human? We're all human, Sarah gestured to her crew. We were sent here to document small businesses, and when we discovered your community, we pretended to be supernatural media because we were afraid you wouldn't be honest with us if you knew we were human." Betty leaned forward, and Sarah noticed the temperature in the room was rising rapidly. "You've been lying to us for 8 months?" Betty's voice was carefully controlled, but small wisps of smoke were escaping her nostrils. "We've been documenting your stories truthfully," Sarah said quickly. "Everything we filmed is authentic. We weren't entirely honest about our audience." Derek stood up, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, he looked genuinely dangerous. "You filmed us being completely open about our supernatural nature because you let us believe we were talking to other supernatural creatures," Derek said, his voice carrying 4 centuries of experience with betrayal. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I understand you're angry," Sarah started. "Angry?" Janet laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sarah, we trusted you with information that could get us killed. There are humans who hunt creatures like us. There are governments that would want to capture us for experimentation. And you've been filming us for human television?" Sarah looked around the room and realized she was facing not just anger, but fear. Real, justified fear about what exposure to human audiences could mean for their safety. "The footage hasn't been broadcast yet," she said. "That's why I'm here. That's why I brought the network executives. We want your permission before we air anything." And our permission? Azeroth's voice carried a demonic edge that Sarah had never heard before. "You want our permission to broadcast footage you obtained under false pretenses?" "We want to work with you to determine how this story should be told," Margaret Stone said, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. "Sarah's footage documents something unprecedented, a successful model for supernatural human integration, but we won't broadcast anything without your consent." Velma, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "What exactly are you proposing?" Tom Bradley pulled out the presentation Sarah had shown to the network. "We'd like to broadcast the documentary as a story about unconventional entrepreneurs who built successful businesses by embracing what makes them different, rather than trying to conform to standard business models." "Without mentioning that we're supernatural?" Marcus asked. "We'd present the footage exactly as it was filmed," Sarah said, "but we'd frame it as a study of innovative community development, rather than a supernatural documentary. Viewers who want to interpret your abilities as supernatural could do that. Viewers who prefer to see you as extraordinarily skilled humans could do that too." Derek was pacing now, which was impressive in a conference room. "And you think that would protect us?" "We think it would allow your story to reach audiences who could benefit from the Grimhaven model without forcing them to confront supernatural reality before they're ready," Sarah said. "What's in it for us?" Betty asked bluntly. Margaret Stone leaned forward. "Honestly, national exposure for your business model, potential franchise opportunities, and documentation of a successful integration approach that other supernatural communities could learn from." "And what's in it for you?" Derek asked. "A documentary series that could genuinely change how communities think about economic development and individual potential," Tom said. "Whether the subjects happen to be supernatural becomes secondary to the innovation they've demonstrated." The supernatural creatures looked at each other, and Sarah realized they were having some kind of silent conversation. "We need time to discuss this," Velma said finally. "Of course," Margaret said. "Take all the time you need." As the network executives filed out, Sarah lingered, knowing this might be the last conversation she ever had with the community she'd come to care about. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm sorry about the deception, but I'm not sorry about the documentation. Your story deserves to be told." Derek stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Sarah," he said, "in 400 years, I've learned that the most dangerous humans aren't the ones who hunt us or fear us. They're the ones who want to help us without understanding the consequences." "What do you mean?" "I mean that good intentions don't protect supernatural creatures from human societies that aren't ready to accept our existence." Marcus nodded. "The question isn't whether your documentary would help humans understand us better. The question is whether we'd survive that understanding." Sarah left Grimhaven that day, not knowing whether she documented the beginning of a new era of supernatural human cooperation, or whether she'd inadvertently betrayed a community that had trusted her with their secrets. The answer came 2 weeks later, when Velma called with the supernatural community's decision. "We'll do it," Velma said, "but with conditions." "What conditions?" "First, Any supernatural creature who appears in the documentary gets final approval over how their footage is used. Second, the network establishes a fund to support other supernatural communities who want to try the Grimhaven model. And third, if this goes badly, if we face persecution or violence because of the exposure, the network takes responsibility for relocating and protecting everyone who participated. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. And if it goes well, then maybe we'll have created a model that helps both supernatural and human communities understand that being different isn't something to hide, it's something to celebrate. 1 year after Sarah Chen first walked into the Grimhaven Community Center, Fed Up, the Grimhaven Experiment premiered to the largest audience in documentary television history. The series was marketed exactly as Sarah had proposed, as a study of unconventional entrepreneurs who had built successful businesses by embracing what made them different, rather than trying to conform to standard models. The promotional materials focused on the economic transformation of Grimhaven and the innovative business practices that had made it possible. But viewers watching the actual footage saw something else entirely. They saw Marcus delivering packages at speeds that seemed to defy physics, his enhanced senses allowing him to navigate routes that GPS systems couldn't map. They saw Betty cultivating plants with controlled fire breathing that produced agricultural results no conventional farmer could match. They saw Azeroth creating coffee with techniques that appeared to involve actual flame manipulation, producing flavors that customers described as impossible. They saw Derek providing business consulting based on centuries of experience that no human could have acquired in a single lifetime. They saw Janet working medical shifts that would have been impossible for any living person, her unique physiology allowing for patient care that redefined what emergency medicine could accomplish. Within 24 hours of the premiere, #Grimhaven Real or Not was trending worldwide. Half the audience was convinced they'd watched the most elaborate performance art project in television history. The other half was convinced they'd seen documentary evidence that supernatural creatures were living among humans and contributing to society. But the most interesting response came from a third group, viewers who didn't care whether the subjects were supernatural or human, but were inspired by the core message that communities could thrive when they created space for people to contribute their unique abilities. Whether they're vampires or just really dedicated business owners, wrote one reviewer, the Grimhaven model offers a blueprint for economic development that could work in any community willing to embrace unconventional approaches. Supernatural creatures across the country began contacting the Grimhaven Cooperative, asking for guidance on implementing similar models in their own communities. But they were outnumbered by humans, entrepreneurs with unusual skills, communities struggling with economic development, and individuals who had spent their lives trying to fit into conventional molds but had been inspired to embrace what made them different. 6 months after the broadcast, Sarah returned to Grimhaven to film a follow-up special. What she found was a town that had become a pilgrimage destination for both supernatural creatures seeking integration and humans seeking inspiration. The irony, Derek said, sitting in his expanded consulting office, which now employed both supernatural and human staff, is that by being honest about who we are, even without explicitly saying what we are, we've created something that works for everyone. The Grimhaven model had been implemented in 12 cities across North America. Some were led by supernatural creatures, others by humans with unconventional skills, but all were built around the same principle: building businesses and communities around what people could do exceptionally well, rather than forcing everyone to conform to standard templates. Do you ever regret participating in the documentary? Sarah asked Marcus, who now ran a delivery service that employed dozens of drivers with various unusual abilities, some supernatural, some merely human, but exceptional. The opposite, Marcus said. For the first time in my life, I don't have to choose between being who I am and being successful. And apparently, that's something a lot of people can relate to, regardless of whether they transform into wolves under the full moon. The final shot of Sarah's follow-up special was taken from the same rooftop where she'd filmed her original conclusion. And now, instead of documenting an experimental supernatural community, she was looking out over a thriving model of integration that was being studied and replicated across the world. Whether the residents of Grimhaven are supernatural creatures or extraordinarily talented humans, may never be definitively answered, Sarah said in her closing voiceover. But what's certain is that they've proven something important, that communities succeed when they create space for everyone to contribute their best abilities, rather than insisting that everyone be the same. As the camera pulled back from the thriving streets of Grimhaven, where beings who might be human and might be something else work together to create something unprecedented, Sarah realized she documented more than just a successful integration experiment. She documented the beginning of a world where being different wasn't something to hide, but something to celebrate, regardless of whether that difference was supernatural or simply human potential that had never been allowed to flourish. And in support groups, business meetings, and community centers across the country, people were watching the series and asking themselves the same question that had started it all. What if, instead of trying to fit in, we built a world where everyone could contribute what they do best? Period. The answer, it turned out, was Grimhaven. And Grimhaven was just the beginning.